now, democracy is very much a faded dream for the indefinite future in that country, and there is no end to the war in sight. It's very difficult to foresee mechanisms that could credibly produce a ceasefire and stop the war.
Now, we spend a great deal of time, not least on this radio station, talking about the conflicts in the Middle East and in Ukraine. But one of the most deadly in the world at the moment is happening in Sudan. More than 11 million people are now estimated to be internally displaced, and over 150,000 people have died. The Times special correspondent Anthony Lloyd has been to Sudan to report on the devastating impact of the conflict there. And he has a 3-part series in The Times. Part 2 is in the edition today and, of course, on thetimes.com. And he has made a film of what he found there, which you can also see at thetimes.com or on the Times Radio app, or on the Times app now, I'm sorry. Here we go, here's a clip.
Sudan's capital is now a battlefield in a war that has triggered the world's worst displacement crisis.
We're in North Khartoum now, which was liberated by the Sudanese armed forces in September, and the front lines are now behind us to the south and just over in the east. This is the legacy of the battle to liberate this area.
Shattered streets, burned vehicles, wrecked lives. Scenes that sit in sharp contrast to those seen here in 2019, when people took to the streets to celebrate the downfall of President Omar al-Bashir and nearly 3 decades of military dictatorship.
So let's talk live now to Anthony Lloyd. Anthony, this conflict began in the April of 2023. Very briefly, if you can, why did it start? What is all this about?
Hello. So, just to take you back to that April 2023, at the time, there were 2 generals who were ruling the country. They were allies. You had General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, who was the commander of the Sudanese armed forces. And then you had General Mohammed Hamdan Daglo, who was commander of the Rapid Support Forces. Now, there was essentially a power-sharing dispute between these 2 figures over how to wrap the RSF, the Rapid Support Forces, under the jurisdiction, under the control, under the command of the Sudanese armed forces. There were existing tensions to do with gold revenues, to do with tribal issues, to do with a whole lot of smaller but very acute issues. But essentially, it was a power-sharing dispute which erupted into violence in the April 2023, 2 years ago.
Was there ever any genuine hope of democracy in Sudan?
I think yes. I mean, if you look back to the protests which started over the price of bread in 2018, then by the time 2019 came round, you had the president, Omar al-Bashir, deposed in a coup which ended nearly 3 decades of military rule. And then there was a key couple of years after that in which there were attempts to civilianize rule, to share civilian and military authority as part of a stepping stone towards the democratization of the process. But that didn't work out. And really by 2022, you had 2 generals back in power. And then 2023, you had them falling out, the start of a civil war. And now, democracy is very much a faded dream for the indefinite future in that country, and there is no end to the war in sight. It's very difficult to foresee mechanisms that could credibly produce a ceasefire and stop the war.
And the international players, I was reading your articles, and the list of countries that are, for whatever reason, involved: Iran, Russia, Egypt, Chad, and the United Arab Emirates. Now, why?
Well, I think it's become slightly oversimplified to call this a civil war between 2 generals. There is that element, but as I say, there's a whole lot of backdrop of other stuff. There's tribal issues of geographical injustice between the west of Sudan and the north. But then you've got a lot of gold resources there too. And you've got countries, regional powers, who each for their own interests, either interested in gold revenues, or in Russia and Iran's cases, are interested in, ports in the Red Sea, port near Port Sudan, Russia under pressure in Syria with its port there at Tartus, very much looking forward for another warm water port in order to give it access to Africa. And then you've got, more local players. You've got Chad, you've got South Sudan, you've got countries like Burkina Faso who either are directly involved in some way or have a huge cache of underemployed young men who are only too happy for the right money to go over and fight in Sudan. So you've got a real regional problem. This is not just a problem within Sudan, confined to Africa's third largest country. It's a regional problem, and its implications are very much regional.
And let's be honest about the fact that there hasn't been a huge amount of international interest in this as a human story. And I suspect one of the reasons for that is that you can't pick a side, can you? Because one side's terrible and the other one's also terrible.
I don't think it's as easy as that. That may be true, and that was certainly put to me by the American Special Envoy to Sudan, Tom Perriello, who said, exactly as you have, there's the bad and then the very bad. But I think it's more simple than that. I think that people are very focused on the wars in Ukraine, wars in Gaza, the situation in the Middle East. Number one, I think it's more difficult for them to grasp what is going on in Sudan. But also, it's a very difficult war to report. Sudan is huge. To get to actually areas where you can report on the driving, it took us, 550 mile drive to get to Omdurman and North Khartoum. That's not something to be indulged in lightly. You've got to commit a lot of time and effort to getting there, to getting the right access and to getting around. It's difficult. It's not just like flying to Poland and driving over the border into Ukraine. You're in Lviv within 4 hours of leaving London.
And the aid agencies that we normally associate with situations like this, are they there?
They're there in the west of the country. I mean, it's one big overall war, but it has very different components as to whether you're in the west, whether you're in Darfur, whether you're in North Darfur, whether you're in the south of the country, or whether you're in the capital, whether you're in Khartoum or Omdurman. You've got a lot of aid agencies over out in the west, in numerous camps for IDPs and refugees over in Chad. Humanitarian access for food and medical supplies is one of the great problems of the war, and it's repeatedly blocked by either side, who neither has shown much hesitation using starvation as a weapon of war when it suits them. So you get one side who won't allow humanitarian supplies, food and medicine, to go through to another side's area. But you've also got, in many areas, this is a very, very frail society, absolutely dependent on the stored harvest from the previous year and the success of the harvest this year. And if you've burned the stored harvest from the previous year and you've destroyed the vehicles or killed the farmers from the harvest areas this year, then you will produce famine for next year. And certainly looking at food security analysts like the Klingendahl Institute last year, very well-respected food security analysts there, predicted that between 6 and 10 million people might die in Sudan of hunger by 2027, according to the current trajectory of the war. They suggested that 6 million deaths was the more optimistic scenario. I mean, this is a really, really big problem that even now, if the harvest was good and there was a ceasefire now, today, you would still have a knock-on huge problem in a few months' time. And there's no sign of the harvest being good or the fighting stopping anytime soon.
Anthony, thank you very much indeed. Times special correspondent Anthony Lloyd, and I really do urge you to read all three of his really impressive articles on the war in Sudan.